The most dangerous person in the room is not the narcissist. It is the empath who has finally had enough, because when an empath breaks, they don't explode. They transform, and that transformation changes the power dynamic forever. If this is resonating with you, if you've ever felt your kindness being weaponized against you, take a moment and really sit with this message. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, because awareness is the beginning of power. Empaths absorb pain quietly because their natural instinct is to understand rather than confront. When tension rises, they look inward first. They ask themselves what they could have done differently. They try to interpret the other person's behavior through compassion instead of accusation. This ability to see multiple emotional layers at once is powerful, but it often leads them to carry emotional weight that does not belong to them. They rationalize disrespect. They excuse inconsistency. They minimize their own hurt in order to preserve connection. Over time, this pattern creates emotional buildup. Every dismissal, every broken promise, every moment of being unheard is stored internally rather than expressed immediately. What makes this dynamic dangerous is that the empath does not erupt at the first sign of mistreatment. They endure, they adjust, they give chances. To the outside world, they appear patient and forgiving. But internally, a quiet threshold is forming. The breaking point does not arrive suddenly. It is constructed slowly through repeated emotional invalidation. And when that limit is finally reached, the shift is not dramatic. It is decisive. The empathy that once extended outward retracts. The understanding that once excused harmful behavior turns into clarity about patterns. Because they have processed everything deeply and thoroughly, when they decide they are done, they are truly done. There is no impulsive reaction, only conclusion. That is why the breaking point of an empath carries so much weight. It represents the moment they stop absorbing pain and start honoring themselves instead. The moment an empath detaches, the supply is permanently cut because their connection was never superficial. When an empath loves, they invest fully. They offer emotional availability, patience, reassurance, and deep understanding. For someone who thrives on validation and control, that kind of emotional presence becomes a powerful source of supply. It provides reassurance, admiration, and a constant stream of attention. As long as the empath remains emotionally engaged, even through conflict, the dynamic continues. Arguments, tears, long conversations, and repeated forgiveness all still count as connection. Detachment, however, is different. When an empath reaches the point of emotional withdrawal, it is not a tactic designed to provoke reaction. It is the result of realization. They have observed the pattern enough times to understand that their energy is being drained rather than reciprocated. Once this awareness settles in, they stop offering emotional access. They no longer respond with intensity. They no longer defend themselves repeatedly. They no longer try to fix what the other person refuses to acknowledge. This shift is profound because it removes the emotional oxygen that sustained the imbalance. The empath's silence is not confusion, it is clarity. Their calm is not indifference born of immaturity, it is detachment born of exhaustion. And unlike temporary distance used to gain leverage, this kind of detachment is final. It reflects an internal decision that the cost of connection outweighs the benefit. Once that door closes, it rarely reopens because the empath has already processed the loss and chosen peace over chaos. When a fed-up empath stops explaining and starts executing, the entire dynamic changes. For a long time, the empath likely tried to resolve conflict through communication. They explained how they felt, clarified misunderstandings, gave detailed examples, and offered emotional transparency in hopes that understanding would create change. They believed that if they could just articulate their pain clearly enough, the other person would finally see it and respond with empathy. But repeated dismissal, minimization, or blame slowly teaches the empath a hard truth. Explanation does not guarantee accountability. Once this realization settles in, something shifts internally. The empath stops over-communicating. They stop defending their feelings as if they are on trial. Instead of announcing boundaries repeatedly, they begin enforcing them. Instead of warning about consequences, they implement them. This is what execution looks like. It is quiet, it is calm, it is action aligned with self-respect. The power in this shift lies in its certainty. A fed-up empath no longer seeks permission to protect their peace. They do not argue for their right to be treated well. They simply adjust their behavior. They reduce access. They withdraw availability. They redirect energy toward themselves. And because they have already processed the emotional layers internally, there is no dramatic performance attached to the decision. It is firm and grounded. This stage feels different because it is no longer fueled by hope that the other person will change. It is fueled by clarity that the empath must change their response. And that clarity makes their actions final rather than reactive. Emotional intelligence becomes strategic power when an empath stops using it solely to accommodate others and begins using it to protect themselves. For a long time, their ability to read subtle shifts in tone, body language, and emotional undercurrents was directed outward. They sensed tension before it was spoken. They anticipated needs before they were expressed. They adjusted their behavior to maintain harmony. This level of awareness made them compassionate and deeply connected, but it also made them vulnerable to manipulation when paired with someone who exploited that sensitivity. Once the empath becomes fed up, that same emotional intelligence no longer functions as a tool for over-accommodation. It becomes a filter. They begin recognizing patterns immediately. They notice inconsistencies without rationalizing them away. They detect manipulation not as confusion, but as data. Instead of internalizing blame, they assess behavior objectively. This shift turns empathy into discernment. Strategic power means they respond intentionally rather than react emotionally. They no longer reveal vulnerabilities to someone who has previously weaponized them. They choose when to engage and when to disengage. They conserve emotional energy instead of offering it freely. Because they understand psychological dynamics so well, they stop being predictable in ways that once benefited the other person. What makes this powerful is that nothing external changes dramatically at first. The empath still appears calm and composed, but internally, they are no longer trying to fix or decode the other person. They are observing, evaluating, and making decisions aligned with self-preservation. Emotional intelligence, once used to sustain the relationship, now safeguards the self. When boundaries turn from flexible to immovable, the empath undergoes one of the most significant transformations of all. In the past, their boundaries may have existed, but they were adjustable. They gave second chances, they made exceptions, they allowed conversations to continue longer than they should have. They bent their limits to preserve connection, believing that understanding and patience would eventually lead to mutual respect. But repeated violations reshape that belief. Over time, the empath realizes that flexibility without reciprocity becomes self-abandonment. When they reach their breaking point, boundaries are no longer suggestions. They become standards. The empath stops negotiating what feels wrong. They stop tolerating behavior that contradicts their values. Instead of issuing warnings or lengthy explanations, they enforce limits calmly and consistently. This shift is not fueled by anger, but by clarity. They understand that protecting their emotional well-being is not selfish, it is necessary. Immovable boundaries feel different because they are no longer reactive, they are pre-decided. The empath does not wait to see how the other person will behave before deciding how they will respond. They already know what they will accept and what they will not. If those standards are crossed, the consequence is immediate and measured. Access is reduced, engagement is limited, energy is withdrawn. This firmness can feel shocking to someone who grew accustomed to the empath's flexibility. But the empath is no longer trying to maintain comfort for others at the expense of themselves. Their limits are now aligned with self-respect, and that alignment makes them steady, grounded, and difficult to destabilize. When the empath no longer seeks closure and instead creates it, a profound internal shift takes place. In the past, they may have searched for final conversations, sincere apologies, or mutual understanding to feel at peace. They believed closure required acknowledgement from the other person, recognition of harm, ownership of mistakes, or at least a shared understanding of what went wrong. Without that validation, it felt unfinished. So they waited, they explained, they revisited conversations, hoping for a breakthrough that would make everything make sense. But eventually they recognize a hard truth. Closure that depends on someone else is fragile. If the other person refuses accountability or continues to distort reality, waiting for resolution becomes another form of emotional attachment. This realization is liberating. The empath understands that peace does not require agreement, it requires acceptance. Creating closure means deciding internally that the chapter is complete, regardless of whether the other person participates in that ending. It means acknowledging the pattern, accepting the lessons, and releasing the expectation of repair. Instead of seeking one final conversation to tie everything together, they allow their actions to close the door. They stop reaching out. They stop revisiting the past. They stop needing the other person to understand their perspective. This self-generated closure is powerful because it removes dependence. The empath is no longer emotionally tethered to unfinished business. They choose finality, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. And once that internal decision is made, it becomes incredibly difficult to reopen what they have already resolved within themselves. When silence becomes their loudest weapon, it signals a level of emotional evolution that is impossible to manipulate. In the past, the empath may have responded to tension with conversation. They addressed issues immediately. They tried to clarify misunderstandings. They filled uncomfortable gaps with reassurance or explanation. Silence once felt unsafe because it created distance, and distance felt like disconnection. So they spoke, even when exhausted. They engaged, even when hurt. But after repeated cycles of being unheard or invalidated, something changes. The empath realizes that not every situation deserves a response. Not every accusation requires defense. Not every provocation deserves engagement. Silence, when chosen intentionally, becomes a boundary rather than avoidance. This silence is not passive-aggressive, it is not meant to punish. It is a form of detachment. The empath stops reacting to bait. They refuse to participate in circular arguments. They decline to defend their character repeatedly. And because many manipulative dynamics depend on reaction, this quiet refusal disrupts the pattern completely. Silence becomes powerful because it removes emotional fuel. There is no energy to twist, no words to distort, no visible frustration to exploit. The empath's calm withdrawal communicates something louder than confrontation ever could. Access has been reduced. This form of quiet is steady and deliberate. It is rooted in clarity, not confusion. And for someone accustomed to controlling narratives through emotional engagement, that silence feels destabilizing. The empath no longer needs to prove a point. Their absence of reaction says everything. Transformation is permanent, represents the final stage of a fed-up empath's evolution, and is what makes them truly formidable. Once an empath has reached their breaking point, enforced their boundaries, detached emotionally, and created their own closure, the shift is not temporary or situational, it is lasting. They no longer revert to old patterns of over-explaining, excusing, or absorbing emotional manipulation. Their awareness, self-respect, and clarity have permanently redefined how they interact with others, particularly with those who once exploited their empathy. This permanence is powerful because it signals to the narcissist, or anyone who relied on their emotional availability, that the dynamic has irrevocably changed. Attempts to manipulate, provoke, or regain control no longer work because the empath's internal framework has been rebuilt. They operate from a place of self-possession, calm, and strategic observation, and their actions reflect consistency, not reaction. This stage also means the empath is now selective with their energy, engaging only in relationships or situations that honor their boundaries and reinforce their autonomy. The permanence of this transformation is what makes a fed-up empath more dangerous than a narcissist. It is not fueled by anger or revenge, but by unwavering self-respect and clarity. Their empathy is now discerning, their response is intentional, and their emotional energy protected. The narcissist can no longer exploit the emotional supply that once fed their control. In essence, the empath's transformation ensures that the patterns of manipulation and dependency are broken for good, leaving them empowered, sovereign, and untouchable in ways that are quiet, strategic, and enduring. This is why a fed-up empath becomes more dangerous than a narcissist. The narcissist thrives on access, attention, and emotional supply. When that supply is permanently cut, the power dynamic collapses. They cannot manipulate, provoke, or control someone who has reclaimed sovereignty over their energy and decisions. The empath does not need revenge or confrontation. Their power lies in the clarity, strength, and independence they embody. Once they detach, the cycle of exploitation is broken, and the narcissist is left facing the consequences of their reliance on someone who no longer exists as a source of supply. This final transformation is not anger, it is mastery, it is self-possession, it is the unstoppable force of someone who loves wisely, protects fiercely, and chooses themselves above all else. The fed-up empath is no longer vulnerable. They are sovereign, and that is a power the narcissist can never reclaim.